Joining me now to discuss is Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. He's on the committees on foreign relations and homeland security. Senator, thanks so much for being here. Will you begin by first responding to what Senator Graham had to say in the aftermath of this tragedy?
You know, Senator Graham is basically one of those individuals who's advocated staying forever throughout the Middle East, and there will never be a good time for him to come home. And I think if you say, well, we're coming home when there is no more ideology of radical Islam, there is no more suicide bombers left in the Middle East, we'll never come home. Our objective when we went in, and this is what the president said explicitly, was to defeat ISIS. He's now taken 99% of their land. Are there remnants of ISIS? Sure. Are there suicide bombers left in the Middle East? Yes, there always will be. But it's not an excuse for staying. In fact, right now we have about 2,000 troops situated somewhere in between the Kurds and 50,000 Turkish troops. Even the ambassador to America from Israel said that it made no sense to have 2,000 troops in the midst of tens of thousands of Iranians, tens of thousands of Turks. Basically, they become a tripwire for a bigger war. They've met success. They met their goal. We shouldn't now change the goal. We did defeat ISIS.
You referenced the Kurds. Of course, one of the arguments from opponents of your view is that we'll be abandoning them.
The problem is that you're in the midst of a war that's been going on even longer than the war in Syria, and that's a war between Turkey and elements of the Kurds. And so is that our job? I mean, are we there to create a nation for the Kurds? Are we there to create nations for every group that has a grievance in that area? No, I don't think so. The Kurds have been brave fighters, and they've been good allies of us, and the Turks see them completely in an opposite way. But, you know, if you want to, and American people want to be the defenders of the Kurd and set up a Kurdistan over there and go to war for the Kurds, then let's vote on it in Congress. See, the Constitution was very specific on this. The president's not allowed to do this anyway. The whole procedure of being in Syria was never approved in a constitutional way. But if you want to be there forever, if Lindsey Graham wants to be there forever, put it to the Senate, put it to Congress, and let's vote on whether or not we're going to be at war over there. I think the American people are actually with me and also with the president on this.
So let's tick through some of the other complaints that would be coming from an opponent of your view. Iran. We've now tipped the balance of power in the Middle East toward Iran by our plan to withdraw from Syria.
Actually, we've tipped the balance in favor of Iran by toppling Saddam Hussein. And this is something the president gets better than almost anybody, and he's been unafraid to say it. He's been very bold about it. The biggest foreign policy mistake of our lifetime, bar none, was deposing and getting rid of the regime of Saddam Hussein, because that did actually tip the balance. It created chaos. And guess what? Iraq, their best ally now is Iran. Iran has a great deal of influence in Iraq, but that's because we got involved with regime change. That is the lesson of the Middle East. Every time we've had regime change, we've actually got unintended consequences.
Okay, criticism number 3, and then I'll be finished, at least in this respect. We've now lost whatever leverage we might have with Bashar al-Assad.
There is no leverage with Bashar al-Assad. Basically, he won the war. And it's you know, I'm not a fan of Assad, but at the same time, I'm also not a fan of the Sunni extremists that people in our government like Lindsey Graham have been so in love with and who have supported. The Sunni extremists that we have given weapons to have said, yeah, they hate Assad. They're indifferent, frankly, to ISIS. And when they're done with Assad, they'll go for Israel and the Golan Heights. So these aren't good people. And so sometimes wars don't have good people, and it doesn't make sense to be involved. That's why the Constitution wanted us to have a significant public debate before we went to war.
You met with the president in the White House after this tragedy in Syria this week. What, if anything, can you tell us about that meeting?
You know, that his primary concern was for the lives lost, for the soldiers. He referenced his trips to Walter Reed, how profoundly it affects him to see these soldiers, you know, missing limbs, soldiers with, you know, post-traumatic stress. You know, I think this is something that a lot of people haven't seen publicly, how concerned the president is for the soldiers and how he takes it as a burden and as an ominous responsibility to decide whether we're at war or not. Now, really, we should share the responsibility. Frankly, Congress should be involved in making this decision. But I think it does affect the president profoundly. And to those who say, oh, they were killed because we're leaving, no, they're killed because we were there. And the longer we stay, the more of our soldiers will be killed. And basically 2,000 soldiers are targets. The Arabs on both sides, they love to kill Americans because it makes international news and it drags us further into their quagmire. Ultimately, I think the end of terror, the end of radical Islam, comes when Islam steps up. Islam has to police Islam. The Islamic countries have to police them. And I say, for goodness sakes, there's 1% of ISIS left and they can't take care of them. Why is it always our job? Why is it always our soldiers that have to lay their lives on the line? I think it's time for the Arabs to stand up and police their own nations.
Senator Paul, some wondered whether the tragedy this week in Syria, the death of 4 Americans, would slow the president's withdrawal plan. You came out of that White House meeting and you said you thought, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, Afghanistan would be next, meaning that, if anything, this would accelerate withdrawal from the Middle East. Speak to that issue.
You know, I can't give you a timetable. I can say that if you look at the president's public statements on endless war, perpetual war, that's the language that people like myself and others who have grown very weary of these wars that go on forever, really on the right and the left of the political spectrum, have been using. And so I've been more and more encouraged with what he's saying. You know, he's announced publicly they're going to remove some troops from Afghanistan. And what I said when I came out of the White House is, you know, it won't be as quick as some of us would like I would like, but it will happen. But I can tell you, you've got other Republicans, the hawks that were in that meeting, saying we can't have a precipitous leaving of Afghanistan, and yet 17 years and they're calling it precipitous. This is the problem. The neoconservatives that want to stay forever, they will tell you that in 10 years. Well, we can't have precipitous withdrawal from the Middle East, and it's a retreat. It's not a retreat. We won the war. I challenge the State Department folks, and people come in, I say, tell me one person. Give me the name of one person who was involved with 9/11 or helped the terrorists in Afghanistan who's alive, and I say, let's go get them. Give me the name of one person. They don't exist. We're now fighting people who weren't born at the time of 9/11. We have not authorized what's going on in Afghanistan. We should vote again. And I think the American people, in most polling, have shown somewhere between 50 to 60%. Some polls show above 60% say it's time to come home.
So I'm hearing from you that you're in lockstep with President Trump. To the extent that's accurate, is John Bolton on your team, meaning the Trump-Rand Paul team? Because he seems at odds with some of that which you've said.
You know, one of the things that John Bolton's been saying is that the conditions for withdrawing from Syria are Iran leaving. That I've never heard the president publicly or privately say. The president said he was going to defeat ISIS and come home. So the question is, will he take direction? And I don't have any evidence to say he won't take the president's direction. But if you change the conditions and if you say we're not coming home till Iran comes home, guess what? That's a statement for saying we're never coming home. For example, is Iran in Iraq? Yes. Is Iran in Lebanon? They are, in various proxies. Hezbollah are throughout the Middle East, and they are also in Syria. Are they coming home anytime soon? Probably not, and that would mean we stay forever, and then we stay as sitting ducks with 2,000 people there. So if you really want to be at war and you want to take over the Middle East and make it a province, and we'll have a provincial governor of Syria, you're going to have to send about 100,000 people in there, and they're going to have to stay forever, and you'll have to fight a pitched battle. We're not going to do that, so why would we send a pittance in there to make them sitting ducks for the enemy? So, no, I think the president's right. Win your battle, win the war, and then come home.
The symmetry between yourself and President Trump on foreign policy is not something I would have anticipated as I reflect in my mind's eye back on those early Republican debates, some of which got rather testy and personal between the two of you.
First of all, Rand Paul shouldn't even be on this stage.
What explains for the emergence of this odd couple relationship?
You know, I think the interesting thing is a lot of people didn't know exactly who Donald Trump was when he came on the scene. He was fairly new to activity in the Republican Party, and those of us who challenged him, who wanted to offer a different vision, of course, we wanted to accentuate what we perceived to be the differences. But, you know, I think as the campaign went on and you got into the general election, you started to find out that, you know what, on issues of war, Donald Trump was for less intervention than Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton's actually was always, and this was just an ironic thing, She was liberal on economic policy, but she was actually very, very hawkish on involvement throughout the Middle East. She was one of the ones, involved with the Benghazi thing that I think was an arms running operation to Syria. And I think she was also a big proponent in the Obama administration of arming people who I didn't consider really to be our friends in Syria in that war. So I think Donald Trump, when you look at it, a lot of his instincts, and he kept saying over and over again, the Iraq war was a mistake, and he still says it to this day. And the lesson of that, if the Iraq war was a mistake, basically regime change in the Middle East has been a mistake. And that's a value that he and I share. And it's not me influencing him at all. It's me saying, hooray, we finally have a president who's not going to keep us at war forever.
Senator, thanks for coming back to the program. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael.